Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. We're going to give folks a chance to get on to the webinar before we start. But thanks, I see we already have several dozen attendees. Terrific. Welcome those who are joining right now. We're just going to give everyone about 1 minute to join before we get started. So in the meantime, while folks are gathering, I want to just introduce folks to a few features of Zoom, the Zoom webinar, which is probably becoming everybody's new good friend over these last weeks, and certainly will be true over the next weeks. But you should be able to see and hear myself, Meera Chari, a partner here at Bridgespan, and all of our panelists who will introduce themselves in a moment. We cannot see or hear you. So if you do want to communicate with us, there are two ways to do that. One is through the question and answer function. So you should see that on your Zoom panel. So feel free to ask us a question. That'll only come to us, so we'll see that. And we'll either answer it live or we can save that till the end if we can. The other way is through the chat, and we're hoping to use this a lot so that we can really get a dialogue going as much as you can via Zoom. So our first way to start that is I'm going to start a chat right now to all of the panelists and attendees that just says, please introduce yourselves. So if you can just take a moment to just introduce yourself with your name, what organization you're with, and what city you are from. Everybody on this call is from a Leading for Impact cohort, so we'd love to get a sense of where folks are coming from. Terrific. Hi, Brent. You should be able to change your setting to chat with all panelists and attendees, or you should see something that says to chat with all panelists and attendees. Try to do that, please, so that we can all see it. Thanks, Kim from Deborah's Place in Chicago. Brian from City Year in Detroit. I'm, of course, not able to read all of the names, but hopefully folks are seeing these come in. Gloria from Legal Aid Chicago. Terrific. We're getting all of our cities represented. Kristen from Fair Chance in DC. Wes from Boston. Terrific. Another way to get our attention, if you need to do that, is to use the raise hand function. If something urgent is surfacing, if you can't see us, or if there's a technical glitch, please raise your hand so that we know that we can see you. We can call on you. Terrific. Great. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. For those of you who are perhaps representing folks from your organization that couldn't attend, we are recording this, so we'll send out the recording to you all. Feel free to share it if you think that would be helpful. This is, again, thank you so much for all of our panelists for taking the time to be here, and thank you all of you who are attending for also spending an hour with us. We know that this is an incredibly uncertain time where things are changing every minute, and many folks are getting different directives even in the last 12 hours, 24 hours, and things are rapidly changing. So we hope that this will be a helpful use of your time, and we thank you in advance for your contributions. So let me hand it over now to Preeta Nayak.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Meera. My name's Preeta Nayak, and I am a partner at Bridgespan and the head of our Leadership and Community Services group, which is the group that does the work of LFI as well as the accelerator. And I've also had the pleasure specifically of working with our Seattle and Atlanta cohorts in the past. So good to see some of you on the chat here already. Meera and I, as she said, are really glad that you're able to join us during what we know is, to put it lightly, a challenging time for all of us as you're leading your organizations and your communities while also caring for family and friends. The reason we're gathering you is because while I think it's fair to say we're all a little fragile right now, we also recognize the power of this group and the power of these leaders, and also that support from peers may be particularly valuable right now and in this moment. And in particular, our colleagues in Seattle have been on the leading edge of this experience here in the US, and we want to give them a chance to share what they're learning, what they've been doing, with the recognition that no one has simple answers right now, but that sharing with one another has power. So in a moment, I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. And then over the next 40 minutes or so, we'll ask them to share their perspectives. But as Mira noted, we'd also love to hear from all of you via the chat function so that we can expand the range of what we're talking about with our panelists, but also understand where you have a hunger and a desire for more information and support, because this is something that will help us as Bridgespan also think about what we do for you. So with no further ado, let's turn it over to introductions from our panelists. Mira, if you can take us to that, wonderful, to that slide. Will, I'm going to ask you to start us off telling us a little bit about yourself and your agency.
Yeah, hi, I'm Will Berkowitz. I'm already finding my dog coming and going, so I apologize for that, as well as my kid. I'm the CEO of Jewish Family Service. I'm a rabbi as well, and we're a multi-service agency who serves the whole sweep of the Jewish and non-Jewish community in Seattle, from refugee resettlement, emergency services and food bank, domestic violence and counseling, teen and young adult, seniors. Yeah.
Thank you, Will. And I'll note that Allie Franklin, who was hoping to join us, had to take care of some urgent business at Crisis Connections this morning and sends her apologies. But let's shift now to Jorge. Jorge, could you share a little bit about yourself and Northwest Immigrant Rights?
Yes, hello everybody. I hope everybody's staying safe and healthy. My name is Jorge Barón. I'm the Executive Director of Northwest Immigrant Rights Project. We are a nonprofit organization providing immigration legal services here in the state of Washington. We have 4 offices across the state, 2 in Eastern Washington in kind of a rural area of Washington, and then an office here in Seattle, as well as an office in Tacoma that works primarily with folks who are at the Northwest Detention Center, which is an regional immigration detention center. And I'll talk a little bit about how that's been one of the challenges that we've been facing. You know, our work deals a lot with federal immigration agencies, so that's been an interesting dynamic here as well that I'll talk about later. Just to get for you to have a sense of what our organization, our scope, we have about 120 staff right now across the state. And thanks everybody for joining.
Thank you, Jorge. And Jody, tell us a little bit about your work with youth care.
Sorry, get myself unmuted. I'll also say that when folks were introducing themselves, there was clearly a lot of participants from the Detroit cohort. I just have to say, Michigan area native, so what's up, Mitten people? Nice to see hometown represented on this call. But I'm Jody Waits. I'm the Development and Communications Officer at Youth Care. I've been there for 6 years in Seattle in some form of policy or philanthropy for the last 23 years. And Youth Care serves young people experiencing homelessness and housing instability from ages 12 up to 25th birthday. And so across the Seattle area, we own or operate 15 locations and have staff embedded in another 7. On an average year, we'll serve 1,500 or 1,600 young people, and we tend to think of ourselves as whatever the first thing is that a young person needs, we say yes, and then we build a plan from there. So in a more regular time, that's everything from shelter and hygiene and food, kind of emergent response, to working on housing and family connectivity, a lot of interactivity with the foster care and juvenile detention systems, both pleasant and unpleasant, and then a really dense body of work around employment and education, recognizing that our age group has a lot of interest in finding a viable way to be sustainable in our very intense Northwest economy. And the thing they want from us the most is a chance to be independent. So at the time, that's the portion of our work that is really taking an exhale while we focus on keeping young people safe and well. But I'll report in that our first 24 hours of this very new week have been pretty good. It's nice to meet everyone.
Thank you so much, Jody, Will, and Jorge. So let's dive into some conversation. The topics we're going to talk about today, and this will not be a surprise for all of our audience, because these are the topics within LFI that we've repeatedly touched upon as important areas of your management mandate, but that obviously are manifesting themselves in different ways today, are how you been thinking about program impact and service delivery. How are you managing and supporting your culture and your people? What does it look like to lead your organization, and particularly the functioning of your executive team at this time? And last but certainly not least, how are you thinking about and preparing as funding and financial sustainability goes? So in each of these topic areas, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask a couple of the panelists to start with some opening remarks, then recognizing that we'll also be looking at the chat to see what's on folks' mind and diving in. I don't anticipate we'll be able to cover any of these things in fullness, but hopefully touch on some of the things that will be most valuable for the group. And so with that, let's start talking about program delivery and some of the shifts that you all have been making to manage this time. Jody, I'm going to actually start with you and see if you can chat a little bit, and then Will, I'll turn to you.
Great. Well, good morning. I think in general, we've tried to take this, extremely unprecedented situation, as everyone needs to, day by day. But now that we're all of a month in, it's kind of easy to look back and see things progressing kind of a week at a time. And on the front end, we really focused on how do we go just full bore into constant communication with our teams. What are we hearing from public health? What are the directives from our government partners? How do we keep new hygiene and disinfecting practices on deck and able to be attained when the whole world wants hand sanitizer and Clorox wipes? So really just a ton of information out to our teams. And frankly, for the first 2 weeks, our approach was to just maintain business as usual for as long as that was viable. There was a very clear turning point here in King County when Seattle Public Schools announced a long-term closure, which was followed shortly by closure of schools across the state, which was then followed by the National Declaration of Emergency. And that all came in about a 48-hour period. And when we came back the next Monday, as the National Declaration was over the weekend, it was evident that we were turning the corner into something far different, and the premise that we could just keep kind of doing our best to keep everything shored up just had to transition to an emergency response. So we spent a couple of days really with all the Post-it notes and creative thinking of our executive team and our program leadership to really say we've got 3 critical goals at this moment. One is we need to transition our services and consolidate our best resources to focus primarily on shelter, housing, food, and basic emotional safety. We do so many things beyond that on a daily level, but today we really need to figure out how do we put all of our bandwidth into those 4 basic functions. Who moves, who changes locations, who needs training, and how do we make that happen? So goal number 1 was keep our most core services highly functional for young people. Second goal was to really look and say, in that, how do we build a model that mitigates or lowers risk around direct interactions and kind of extend length of shift so there's fewer people coming and going from each of our critical locations. We had to suspend our volunteer program. We had to suspend community members bringing us needed items, which really would have been helpful, but we couldn't risk that kind of foot traffic. So second big goal was how do we build a model that limits the amount of direct interactivity and the number of transitions, do our part to flatten the curve as best as possible. And frankly, the third goal for us was to really try to find a way where we did have the chance to maintain safety, lower risk, and frankly, if at all possible, not have layoffs or furloughs at this point, recognizing that moving to a 24-hour care model would take everyone. So as of the transition over this weekend, our employment and education work and our work to reunite families and some of our other community presence portions of our mission are on pause. And everyone is focused on a 24-hour shelter and housing model where young people come into our care go through a basic health screening to be certain, at least at this time, as best as we can determine without a lot of testing, that they are well. And then they commit to being with us in that space on a 24-hour cycle. So the exchange is a bit of a loss of mobility and freedom for young people on a day-to-day basis, which is hard when you're 19, but it also means that there's a guarantee of consistent 24-hour care with all meals, all supports. We have doctors coming and going, activities, and shelter. And until further notice, that's how we're going to function. And that allowed us to attain all three of those goals that we set out on the front end.
Thank you so much, Jody. I mean, such a whirlwind. I think when we start talking a little bit about executive teams a little later, one thing that'll be great to hear from you is it seems as though you both had to get creative and make some decisions fast that were pretty high stakes decisions. And so the extent to which later, as we're talking about team functioning, you can talk about that, that'll be great.
Yep, sure thing.
Will, let me turn it over to you. And I imagine, given the range of functions your agency serves, that you've had a similar set of conversations, but tell us what you've been experiencing.
Sure. So I'll sort of brush over some of these things, and then Preeta, if you want me to pull back into them, you'll just let me know. So pretty much the first day, the first Friday, there was couple cases that came out in Seattle where a young person and an older person were diagnosed. So the next day, that Saturday, we organized our crisis management team because for me, it might be embedded in my DNA, but I'm always waiting for the other shoe to drop. So this was like, oh, yay, I wasn't wrong about my anxiety that something terrible was going to happen. It did, yay. So for us, what we did is we organized our crisis management team, and we felt that the most important thing was to put a plan in place to start to sort of understand the situation in terms of what we were going to do with our staff and with our volunteers. And what we found was it just seemed like every time we got something in place, a new thing would happen. So we were always barely one step ahead of the next decree, so to speak. I feel like it was like that character in Harry Potter. They'd pound up some new thing on the wall, and there'd be a new decree barring people from getting together and barring people from the Dumbledore Society or whatever. So what we did was we started by we did disband all of our volunteer activities because we wanted to eliminate the risk as much as possible. We heightened we pretty much immediately started putting in place opportunities for people to work from home. The heavy lift, and I would say to all of you who have tech support, again, I recognize by now, many of you are probably in a very similar boat. So we're maybe a day or two ahead of you, but we're no longer weeks ahead of you. But feel free to ask whatever questions. I'll say that one of the biggest hits will be to your tech side of things, because shifting, in our case, an organization which has always been face-to-face relationship building in person in the buildings around the community to going online in the span of a week is an incredibly heavy lift for your IT team. So you need to figure out, I sat down with our IT team and said, okay, what additional support you need, because this is going to be a marathon, not a sprint. I need you to really take care of yourself. Because I'd say that that's where one of the biggest lifts came first, was to them. What we did also is we created an audit that we spread across, asked every director across the agency to fill out, and the image that I had in mind was a body going hypothermic. So what are the nice to do things? What are the if you start increasingly shunting more and more of your core resources toward the core services, what are they, so that we could gradually scale back as needed, but we didn't feel like we needed to do it instantly. In fact, we still haven't. But it was very important for us to understand what those services would be and those critical functions. What we also did is because of the nature of this particular crisis, is we wanted to understand who's cross-trained within each team. So if somebody on a team were to go out, and then who's cross-trained between intra-departmentally as well. So if, say, a director went out, or if we needed to very quickly scale up, which is what we're seeing happening, how would we cross-train and cross-functionally. What that also did is, because we knew that some teams were going to be more or less not sure what they were going to do, it gave them some security for some of their staff that we weren't going to be just laying people off left and right. We've built a series of leadership principles at JFS Seattle that have been in place for 6 years now. So we've constantly refined those. And so we would go back to those leadership principles and our values when making decisions. So they weren't just kind of abstract decisions. What we also did is we really viewed this as an opportunity to rethink some of the ways that we did things. So it's also a great opportunity to get the teams to look more deeply at what they do. I've talked to our staff about the idea of eliminating friction in the system. So really thinking about, okay, this is a time to sort of strip back any unnecessary friction and to look at all those systems and look at the processes. So, you know, are all of those intake questions the way they're currently done? Is that the most effective way we can do this? Is there a different way we can deliver food? So we shifted, and again, I imagine by now everybody's done this, but we used to have a kind of a grocery store model for a food bank. We really instantly shifted to handing out bags of food to protect both the volunteers or the people that are handing out the food as well as the people receiving them, because over 64 or 5% of the people who use our food bank are seniors. I really could continue to talk, but I think there are probably other folks that have what to say as well.
Thanks, Will. No, that's terrific. And you actually have started to touch upon, both you and Jody, some of the areas that relate to just your people and how you are managing them and their morale and communications and culture in the organization. So let's turn to that topic. And Jorge, let me ask you to start us off, thinking a little bit about this, and then Will, I know you and I have talked about some of the steps you've taken as well.
Sure. Well, you know, and I want to first say that I think when I was asked to be part of this panel, I said, you know, we're really trying to figure out. It's not like we have answers, because I think of course everybody who's listening to this, I know is struggling with some of the same issues, and I don't think that there is a right answer to any of this. And in fact, I mean, I think everybody's sort of trying to do, I think we're all trying to do our best, given the very difficult situation. And I think that you know, I think Will and Jody have talked about this, the uncertainty is kind of like the hardest part. And for us here, it's been this, as I think Will was mentioning, sort of like the new edict. And so one of the ways, you know, in terms of communicating to staff, we created the set of interim procedures, what we called it, that we would put in place, and that sort of outlined how we were changing our day-to-day work. And what we've, you know, because it's changed so frequently, what we did is that we kind of kept the same document, and then every time we updated, I just sent like a track changes version and a new clean version, so that staff don't have to read the whole memo, but just go to the sections that I've actually changed from the last version, because we've literally done like, you know, now 5 or 6 revisions of the same document, because there's new things. In fact, you know, just before this webinar, I was sending around the latest version based on the fact that our governor issued a stay-at-home order just last evening. So I think the struggle has been to be able to communicate with folks about all these changes without sort of overwhelming them. And I think the other challenge that we've had, which I kind of hinted at earlier, has been that we are dealing with a situation where we are you know, somewhat at the mercy of having to make decisions, not ourselves, but be dependent on some of the federal agencies. So just to give you an example of how that played out, we were literally, when, you know, the president in one of the press conferences was issuing this new guidance about having, you know, no gatherings larger than 10 people. And as this was happening, we had staff who was at one of the immigration offices here locally, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, you know, sending messages about concerns they had about the fact that they were in this big waiting room with like over 50 people, because this government agency had chosen to continue, you know, processing things and had all these people in this big room. And so, so it was a struggle because, of course, we had obligations to our clients and could just, not attend their interviews or the hearings. But of course, there was an understandable concern about the impact that might have both on staff and clients. We've had the same dynamic with relation to the detention center, the immigration detention center, where our staff are not even as much concerned about their own health, but more concerned about the fact that they could, inadvertently bring the virus into an immigration detention center where it could have devastating impact. We actually have a lawsuit pending right now against the ICE to try to get some of the people who are high at risk out of detention, which we have not been successful on so far, but we're still fighting that right now. And so, so I think it's been hard in terms of communicating with staff about some of these things. I think what we've tried to do is to make sure that we had good information and we rely on science regarding the issues. I think for those of us, particularly here in Seattle, where this was kind of the first time that we all were learning the risks. Initially, we had a lot of concerns about people who said, well, I was in contact with somebody who was in contact with somebody else, and so does that mean that I have to be, out of the office? And so we had to actually, and one of the great, things that I'm very grateful for was that actually we recently had hired an HR director who's played a key role in handling all of these situations, who was in constant communication with public health, the local public health office, who frankly I think has been really great here locally. To be able to sort of provide guidance and to be able to sort of calm people's nerves about some of their concerns about these situations. So I think we just I think everybody said just to be understanding that this is a very dynamic situation. I think now, and I think this is the challenge that I think we're all going to have, is I think people are now, there was that kind of transition into this new mode of doing business, and I think there's still some challenges with that. But I think that the challenge that I think I'm looking ahead to, and I'm sure many of you are thinking about this, is the concerns that people are starting to have about the future, and how long does this go on, and then of course concerns about the impact that this is going to have in terms of funding and our ability to continue to maintain staffing levels, which I know we'll talk about later with the funding issue. But I think that's the part that I think in terms of keeping morale up, it's difficult, because I think right now in my conversations with the executive team, we're trying to strike a balance to reassure people that we actually don't have to make any decisions suddenly, because we do have healthy reserves, but we also don't want to overpromise, because I think that we are facing a situation that I think none of us have experienced before, and we don't want to be unfair by saying something that may prove not to be true in these unprecedented times. So it's challenging, because I think I wish I could give sort of people more clarity. I think we all do, and what we've been trying to do is just to tell people what we know at a particular point and be listening to their questions.
Jorge, thank you for, I think you've touched upon a lot of the nuance that every leader on this call is navigating. One question from folks on the line for each of you is actually how frequently you are communicating with your staff or subsets of your staff, and are there particular agenda items or ways you're thinking about that? And I'll just go ahead and make the ask of all of you, which is that if you do have sample communications or anything like that you think would be helpful to others who are even a day behind, if you send our way, we'll make those available. But first, just the question, how often and what's the core content? Jody, you're at the top of my screen, so I'm going to start with you.
Yeah. I would say on the front end, again, we had something going out daily, all agency, with even just a basic, what did we hear? Here's new guidelines from public health. Here's some feedback about HUD around appropriate distancing of shelter sleeping spaces. And so On the front end, I would be happy to officially release all of those emails. I sent them all to Mira. You just can't hold me accountable for typos when everybody's frantically trying to get daily pieces out. So for the first probably 2.5 or 3 weeks, we had something comprehensive out every single day with a variety of feedback from public health, resources for parents, updates on community guidelines for food bank access. I mean, it was frankly a lot of like vegetable soup. Just put it all in the pot and hope that if you send everything, it will be helpful to people. When we kind of started to get our sights on the programmatic transition from business as usual to this really consolidated safety kind of urgent programming model, we tightened it up and took it from a centralized structure through me back down to being held at the team level. Folks on the front end at least reported in that they really needed one single calm, consistent voice and source of information to kind of get the ball moving from, oh my gosh, hey, this is happening, to really being in it. And now that we're, in theory, effectively shifting how we function programmatically, that news distribution and kind of question asking and sense of comfort really needs to come at the team level from leaders in a decentralized way. So we made a very clear transition from one news source to now I distribute news out to directors and program leadership probably every other day, and then folks are disseminating that within their groups through whatever channels teams have set up. If that's posters or a quick chat or a Zoom meeting or whatever it might be, we'll see what evolves, but it just became really important for folks to have guidance from their functional leadership as opposed to centrally from the administrative center. And on the front end, it was really important that every day at 4 o'clock, you got your email and you got your comfort that folks were tracking on information and sharing it aggressively.
Thank you, Jody.
And I'll happily, I'll send any of those. They're a little crazy formatted under duress.
Thank you. And Will and then Jorge, I don't know if there are other, you know, maybe you've done something quite similar, but to the extent that you have other suggestions related to cadence and content, that would be great on communications.
Yeah, for us, so I would say one of the things that I felt was really important to do was, and I believe this, like this is, I think this is going to make 2008 look like child's play. And so I remember reading once about, and some of you may have read the same thing, I guess it made its rounds, but it was somebody who was a prisoner of war in Vietnam, I think it was. And he was describing the difference between approaches that people took. And some people took the, oh, this will be over by, you know, by Christmas, everybody will be home and everything will be great. And he felt that that was not, he knew that wasn't the case. And so what he said was, we will get home, but it's going to be a lot longer than that, because he wanted to set a very realistic expectation for his crew, whoever they were. And so for me, I've taken that position and saying like, this isn't, we will get through this. We've always gotten through these things, but this will not be done in the short time. This is going to be a long-term thing, and we should be very realistic about that. And it's going to require a tremendous amount of flexibility from everybody. We've chosen to over-communicate very transparently and only things that are true. Like we're not trying to read tea leaves or anything like that, and then put that out to the organization. Our crisis management team has met every day, usually for about an hour, although today it was the first day I'm shortening that down to about a half hour a day. And then our executive team will meet twice a week as opposed to once a week. I've been communicating daily we have sort of a blend between something that I write and then something that is sort of just an aggregate of information. And then we send that to the entire staff. And then I also send it to the board of directors with sort of more higher level information. And that's been the way we've been addressing that. I've really felt, and we've all felt, I should say, that trying to keep people calm, help them stay focused on what the task is at hand, reducing anxiety, giving them courage and support, and recognizing that we've got their backs has been the key thing. So we put in place immediately giving, this was, again, I think by now this is sort of irrelevant for most folks, but we created, like in the first 2 days, we expanded the number of sick days, gave 3 additional sick days to everybody, because the thought was then, and this was like the first week of this whole thing, that we wanted to incentivize people not to come in the building if they were sick, not to feel like they needed to come. And then we also knew there were a lot of staff who had either used their sick time or they were new staff and they hadn't accrued. It takes a month to get a day of sick time. So we wanted to initially put that at ease, and then and so we communicated that. And then more recently, we've created an entire different structure for the next 6 weeks to again keep people feeling at ease and that we've got their backs, recognizing there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty. We've also we recognize that, and we've been calling this out, that some of our staff, the folks who work with disabilities, are the nature of their job forces them in a way which is very different to be much more personally connected with their clients, as opposed to somebody who can do telehealth over the phone. And so really trying to calibrate what can we ask people to do without risking their safety or the safety of their clients. So we've tried to be very responsive to that. And then our directors team, we also meet with them a couple times a week. Again, I can continue, but I'll let other people.
Great. And Jorge, I'd love to hear from you in a second. I will note a comment that Allison, I think, just shared with Allison Jacobson with all of us, which is just that something that I think we can sometimes come as a surprise in this day and age, but is important to ask, is actually what the accessibility is of your staff to tech, and whether there might need to be, I think maybe, Will, this was your first point, some work that your IS team is doing, if you're lucky enough to have an IS team to help those staff. Jorge, I'd love to hear anything more you would say on the communications front before we shift to talking about, I actually will probably push us to talk about some of the funding and financial sustainability questions next.
Yeah, I mean, just real quickly, I think, you know, I think the struggle of trying to like not overwhelm people has been a challenging one, because I think things have been moving so quickly. So you know, as I mentioned, we try to create these procedures so that we'd have one document where all of the sort of changes and all of the questions would get kind of addressed, and try to update that. And we've been updating it, I think, I would say, certainly weekly. And I think there might have been 1 week when we had to do kind of 2 revisions. I think the challenge for us has also been that there's been a lot of questions around just client questions, client community questions, and particularly because for a lot of the clients that we serve, there's a lot of concern about their lack of eligibility for some of the safety net programs. So, you know, undocumented people, for example, are not eligible for unemployment insurance. And so for a lot of folks who are like saying like, oh, well, you know, if you lose your job, go apply for unemployment insurance, that's not an option for a lot of our clients. So trying to figure out what resources they have. And then on top of that, even for the folks who might be eligible, then there's concerns around, does this, you know, impact this new public charge rule? And so a lot of I think the communication, like in some ways, like from the management team, at least, like we're trying to sort of like keep that managed. But I think what's been hard is just to like everybody in the staff is like, you know, sending out questions to everybody, which is good. We want that communication, but I know it's also kind of gotten a little overwhelming because there are so many, you know, uncertainties for our client community that's been hard. And so we're trying to sort of coordinate and try to put together a document that kind of captures all the questions and do kind of an FAQ where there's the resources, because it's just a very fast moving situation, obviously.
Yeah, thank you, Jorge. That makes sense. That in the same way that you needed your HR specialist to think about some of those staff issues, that having someone who's monitoring that policy consistently for your clients makes sense. I want to make sure we talk about what is in some cases a more medium-term issue, perhaps, or a longer term, which is thinking about funding and financial sustainability. And I'll actually ask each of you to touch base on how this has been manifesting itself and how you've been thinking about it. Jorge, I might actually, sorry, I know you just took a sip of water. I'm going to ask you to start us off.
Yeah, no, well, I think this is hard because it's kind of like comes in multiple levels. So for us, and I know that there's a number of organizations, and I think Will may have been on this boat as well, who have been having to deal with questions around fundraising events. And so our fundraising event was scheduled for May 15th. And I don't want to share, but basically we're not going to be moving forward. We haven't sort of made the official public announcement with that, but the decision has effectively been made already. And so we are now having to, so I've spent a fair amount of time, and our development team has spent a fair amount of time and our board spent time thinking through what are the options, right? What are the alternatives? And so that was kind of the most immediate question in terms of fundraising, is how to deal with the potential loss of revenue. And then, so that's the first thing that we've had to deal with. I think the second thing is, how do we then, cope with potential losses in other areas of our fundraising, and then kind of at the same time, one of the concerns that we're starting to sort of hear is the impact that obviously all of this is going to have on revenue for local and state governments, which have become kind of one of our important funding sources. And so it's challenging, because I think you're having to, all of a sudden both work on trying to work in each of those areas, which might be, spending time connecting with your individual donors, figuring out the event issue, but also doing the work perhaps in terms of advocating to make sure that like the programs that we are doing are going to be prioritized in terms of the local government decisions, and it all has to happen kind of immediately. So I think that part is challenging, because I think we keep sort of having discussion that this is there is no roadmap, right? We don't know. The big question, I think Will talked about this, is even in 2008, I remember going through his experience and just thinking like, we just need a bridge to get us through this gap. And the challenge here is that I don't know that many of us see where the other side of this bridge is. And so trying to figure out how to plan is challenging. But I think what I've sort of conveyed to our team is we got to do the best we can, communicate the needs of our clients right now, and be prepared for just a high degree of uncertainty, and make the best decisions we can with the information that we have currently.
Thank you, Jorge. Jody, any thoughts in terms of how you all are wrestling with what I'm sure is a similar set of circumstances?
Yeah, I think just for reference for listeners, we run about a $17 million annual budget, and with some relative variance, it's about 65 to 70% public dollar funded from city, county, state, and federal sources, and 30 to 35% of that, about 5 million annually, comes in from philanthropic or kind of private dollar sources. And frankly, through our work with LFI, we've gotten much more nimble at looking broadly at our revenue opportunities and kind of thinking about what's the best strategy for where public dollars are excited right now and where philanthropy is excited right now, and kind of coming at that strategically. To echo Jorge, I think we're moving into a space where it's really hard to guess what strategy is going to be, so much as just, trying to survive and get over this bridge period. I would say we're in an interesting position in that we, particularly under a declaration of disaster, it would be against the law for us to close. And so in a very strange way, we are hearing pretty consistently from our public dollar contract funding sources about, what do we need, what urgent dollars so that we can stay open. Again, really looking at housing, shelter, and food. But our public contract providers are also concerned and unclear, but in touch and kind of hinting at some new funding sources. And I think for us, as potently, really helping us make the case that we're not going to meet all of our outcomes this year. We can't promise transitions to permanent housing when we're in a 24-hour shelter model in the middle of a pandemic. We can't promise the number of youth graduating from a certain program and getting a first job and having that employment sustained for 6 months when a third of our community just lost their job. So I think it's a short term, we're feeling like folks are interested in hearing about our needs and maybe adding some cash. And in the long term, it feels like one of the things we're going to have to be really direct about is our work has changed, and what we need to be held accountable for, particularly in those taxpayer dollar spaces, is going to look really different, potentially for quite a while. We had an event, it would have been this week, maybe. Our annual luncheon, which is our primary and only fundraising event, was scheduled for March 27th. We made a really early call to go ahead and cancel it for March. We were fortunate to catch the Westin early enough to have them move us to a date in October. We'll see if that lasts, if that's any more viable. It still won't be the same, and it probably won't meet the goal, the revenue goal that's in the budget for a variety of reasons. But it felt like punting to fall at least gave us some ability to adjust to that difference. And I would say in general, because we can't close, we're trying to really hold that there's a very special and powerful story that's being written in human history right now, frankly, and recognizing that our young people, and I get emotional every time I talk about this, so fair warning, and our staff are on the inside where you can't close. And there's just something, I think, for all of us that have essential employees that can't work from home and can't step away and really have to be even more gritty than usual. And social service professionals who are predominantly women, queer folks, and people of color are already underpaid and under-recognized. And in this moment, they're doing even harder work. And so I think we're just trying to hold that our donors are very, very interested in hearing that story. What's it like on the inside of a shelter-in-place model in a homeless services organization? We can tell that story really powerfully right now and advocate for the needs of our young people, advocate for the experience that our program staff in particular are going through. And I will say to everybody out there, 22 years of fundraising later, I have never had people get back to me so quickly. Folks that I've tried to be in touch with for a long time or reach out to, everybody's home, generally speaking, in some macro level. Folks are desperate for human connection. Folks are desperate to be reminded that the things that they have fought for and the values that they hold as an individual and as a family that feel up for grabs at this point, that those are still the things to hold and still the fight to fight. And so I have found, perhaps ironically and unwelcome, that I am having some of the most significant and profound donor interactions I have ever had in my career. And the responsibility of that is incredibly significant. But I would also say people want to hear from us right now, particularly those that are trying to maintain some part of your services. Folks really want to know, are you okay? What are you doing? What can I do to help? We've got a whole brigade of folks now sending daily appreciation notes into our program spaces just to let folks know that they're cheering for them. So even if it feels cheesy, make up some ways for folks to interact. And I would never say leverage the opportunity. It's absolutely not appropriate, but don't lose sight of the fact that the people that love and care about your organization are deeply concerned, deeply, deeply concerned, and really want to hear from you at this point. And not a pretty pep talk. I've had teary, hard conversations with our supporters who don't want to let us down and really want to know that we're okay. And the answer is they might not be able to make a gift for a while, and we're not sure it's going to be okay. But somehow being able to have that conversation and be together in that intimacy is really, really significant. And I would just encourage folks, even if it's 3 phone calls or 3 emails a day, it's also incredibly heartening in these scary times to have people say, can you send a note out to my regular team that I volunteer with, and I really miss them, and let them know I'm thinking about them, and just be in touch with your people. They really want to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Jody. We've had some comments that hopefully you'll see in the chat about how beautifully said that was. And I'll state just two notes that connect with that. One is that I think there is a question about donors and restrictions, which you touched upon a little bit as it comes to like public grants, but I think is probably also true with many foundations or individual donors, that the restrictions they may have placed may be more flexible on. So there's an opportunity to have a conversation about that. The other thing that was coming up a little bit in the chat is this question about government and advocacy and advocating for the sector. And I would just note that Independent Sector has a policy action center that's certainly very active at the federal level and in terms of actually being on the ground and helping with negotiations with the bill that is happening right now in the Senate. And I would imagine similarly at the state level, there are state associations who are actively engaged. So if you have not connected with those, I think it's valuable. Will, I would love to get your thoughts on the financial sustainability question, because I know you and your team have been thinking about this. The other quick factual question that came up was, like you mentioned earlier, your crisis response team, and folks were wondering about the composition of that team.
Sure. So I just want to, there was another question I thought was important. The other thing that we said to our staff, which just so folks know, is a lot of us are used to being perfectionists and having things go just perfect. And we've really gotten to a place organizationally because, you know, dogs and kids are constantly flying in and out of background screens and Zoom calls. Is just, you know, good enough is good enough. And giving people the permission to not get everything right now, I think is very important. Our crisis response team was, our facilities person, who's generally the person who would be in a normal world, she would be the kind of the point person to organize these things, because it would be like an earthquake or something. We did not have an image of a zombie apocalypse, so this is new for us. So it's our facilities person, two of our HR people, our communications person, our COO, our strategy person are the key people on that. And we've expanded it a little bit when necessary to include a couple other folks from the exec team. But generally, the executive team is a smaller, more tight group, and we hold those conversations for more just need a little bit more leadership structure. So that's who's on our crisis response team. In terms of how we've managed, and I'll try to keep this fairly quick because it's not hugely different from what you just said, what other folks just said. You know, so half of our budget comes from philanthropy. We had to cancel our luncheon, which is 1,200 people, and it brings in a third of our budget. So we really sort of leapt into the unknown, you know, to quote Elsa from Frozen, I guess. We have shifted to, and again, I think some folks have said this on the chat, we've really focused pretty heavily on who are our top major donors. We have really been connecting with them, and frankly, I want to say some of them, you know, one of our biggest donors is in the ICU with pneumonia, probably coronavirus. So like we're seeing our major donors, who tend to be on the older side of things, they're afraid and struggling. So to me, having, you know, some of those calls with them and connecting with them are really addressing their own fears and anxiety, because usually they're not quote unquote clients in the same way as some of the other vulnerable people we might be serving. And I use that term very specifically because they themselves are now vulnerable and feeling that. And so I think it's a strange mix of trying to really develop those, maintain and strengthen and hold those relationships, but also recognizing that some of that is really comforting and caring for them as well. We've shifted to a full online strategy. We are not doing like one of these virtual luncheons because we just did not think that would actually be effective at all. We've really pulled in our experts who are on our board, who are communications experts, to help us design that strategy. We've shifted to you know, more specific short video, more specific email. We put a page on our website. We've communicated very directly, and really it's been much more targeted to one-on-one conversations with each of our key donors, who would have made up the bulk of the funding that we would have made during our luncheon. And again, I think I'll just keep it short. And Jorge, are you drinking wine? What are you drinking over there? I was just thinking, I was like, I want that.
It's my jug of iced tea. It's my caffeine.
Okay.
I don't do coffee. I do iced tea. There you go.
Thank you, Will. And I think that it's good to sort of hear the reinforcement from all of you on the kind of the creativity you're deploying at this moment and doing your best to manage through. I think that
Prita, can I say one thing? Prita, can I say one
Yeah.
thing really that I forgot to say this? I think it's really important. People will forgive you now. If you try something new and it doesn't work, you've got a free pass. Like if we had done some of the things we're doing now when we were like 2 months ago, and if it failed, we would have been hearing about that failure. If we try something new today and it doesn't work, it doesn't matter because everyone's going to be very forgiving of trying new approaches. And I think it's really important. I forgot to say this. I think it's really important to lean into the opportunity this provides to try different things as opposed to kind of crouching back into what is the known things that have always worked, because this is like a once in a lifetime chance to try totally different approaches and get it wrong with no penalty.
Will, as usual, you have set me up perfectly. Thank you. Thank you for that. I actually, on that note, know that we have not, we have, only, touched upon the things that people are caring about and the answers that people are seeking. And so I'd like to do one thing as we wrap up. We ourselves, for our LFI community and other nonprofit leaders, are trying to do a few things, some of which we've always done and some of which will be new to help you all. Things like this webinar, but also collecting resources specific to some of the biggest questions that are on your mind so that we can get information out there to you faster. Things like templates, examples of how people are addressing questions. We're also going to be thinking about, so actually, let me just ask now that you answer in the chat, if you can, all of you who are still participating, what are the 1 to 2 issues or areas where you'd like more information and tools?
And Preet, if I can just add one more thing there, in addition to the specific content areas or issue areas, also, are there ways of connecting that would be powerful like this, like smaller kind of peer-to-peer working groups or things like that? We're as to Will's point, we are really open to experimentation. So we would love ideas that you have on not just content, but also format.
Okay, I want to give a minute for people to just dive in and share their thoughts. And I'll ask the panelists, as people are sending their thoughts, to think about one way in which you are caring for yourself in this moment. Because I think one of the things that we heard repeatedly was how much you all and your teams are doing for others. And I want to make sure we also think about, Will, to your point, that this is a long haul, and we need to put on the oxygen mask for ourselves as well. So as those answers come through, let me ask Jody again. You're at the top of my screen, so what are you doing?
I'm not sure I have a ton of great advice on that. I mean, I'll turn a little bit. You can see my pots and pans. There's my wiener dogs. So, you try to find some grounding. My husband has some very thoughtful health complexities. So we're actually in a bit of a familial quarantine for his safety. And so it's been a really curious adventure to commit to. We go on a walk at midnight because that's the safest time of day for him. And just trying to find, for me, as somebody who really loves repetition and ritual and kind of things being the same, that can't happen right now. But what are the ways that we can create that in our homes and in our teams? So for us, a late night walk's been a big deal. Keeping cooking's been a big deal. And my staff, my team is, 14 folks deep. And we have a little way we start the day now over email and kind of check in. And so in whatever ways, just creating something that feels dependable and rhythmic in all environments, and even in the tiniest of ways, feels incredibly satiating at this point.
Jorge, I'll turn to you next.
Yeah, that I think it's hard because I think, like, you know, and it's something that I think, like, we're having to navigate even with all of our staff is, you know, that a lot of us, of course, I have 3 children, you know, school-age children, and so now we're not only dealing with like the programmatic stuff, but also, you know, at home trying to make sure that we share the work of caring for children during school hours. But we also are doing this little walk, which I don't know if under the new stay-at-home order will be allowed, but we do a walk kind of in the evening with the kids, and they go to a nearby sort of play, not a playground, but just a play area that's open by one of the nearby schools, so that they can run around and when there's not other people around. So I feel like it's become a little bit of our routine to let them run around since we don't have that kind of activity, and that's been important to us. That's become a little bit of routine the last couple of weeks.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Now I'm imagining all of Seattle walking around 6 feet from each other. Will, you get the last 15 seconds here.
I'd say trying to keep a sense of humor and laughing, finding joy. I would say running and with my kids and my wife, and I'd say drawing and painting.
Wonderful. Thank you all for joining us, our panelists who've been wonderful, the community who's been online, Mira for facilitating. Thank you all. And we will be in touch both with this recording and other materials.
Bye, everybody.
Thank
Bye.
you.